to trickle in, and then we'll get started. We'll just wait one more minute. Okay, so let's get slowly started while people continue to join us. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining on a Friday afternoon. This is one of over 350 events that have been happening around the world this week as part of Global Open Gov Week. I think this is the third edition, and it seems to go from strength to strength each time. And we actually started the week in Jakarta on Sunday night, East Coast time, and now it's kind of coming full circle to another one of our founding countries, the US, to have this really important discussion today about seizing the moment of the new administration on open government and OGP participation. Just by way of housekeeping, it would be great if people feel comfortable to introduce yourself in the chat function, so we know roughly who's in the virtual room. And please do be avid users of the chat. Definitely would like this to be an interactive discussion, and we'll be looking to bring people in throughout the event to give your opinions on this really important topic. And you can use the hand up function as well when we get into that discussion element to indicate you want to come in. That would be very helpful. Please just try and keep interventions concise so we can hear from as many people as possible. And if you can stay muted when not speaking, that would be really helpful as well. We are recording this event. I hope that's okay with everybody. It's a public event, yeah, this is all on the record. As I mentioned, this is the third Open Gov Week, Global Open Gov Week that the Open Government Partnership has helped to organize. And just of course, we know we're in quite a unique context. Not only, of course, the pandemic, which despite progress, of course, in the US around vaccinations, is still hitting many countries extremely hard in terms of lives and livelihoods, but also our 15th consecutive year globally of decline of civil and political liberties, according to Freedom House. So the context of both the pandemic and democratic backsliding globally obviously is on the front of mind for many in the open government community. And the pandemic in many ways has also revealed these further systemic inequalities in many countries, including the US, that is incumbent, I think, on all of us to figure out how we can play a role in tackling them. And of course, on the flip side, the pandemic has, I think, really shown the value of open government, whether that is in open health data, whether on open procurement, or we've seen many of the procurement scandals around PPE, for example, with closed and outdated procurement systems. but also on tracking the massive stimulus and government spending packages that so many countries, including the US, have been rolling out to ensure they really reach their intended people that really need help. And of course, many public services going online for the first time and using digital platforms to do that. So now the onus, at least in the US, to use the president's word, is on building back better. And this discussion, we hope, can really focus on what building back better looks like for democracy that delivers for more citizens, and how open government can play a role in that. And to that end, we are launching today this fantastic new report that I hope everyone can have take the time to read. The report is called Seize the Moment, Reviving the US OGP Process with the New Biden Administration. And the report author, Neda Zodi, will be presenting the main findings shortly. And a couple of the quotes that Neda pulls from, which I think are just helpful to set the context, is, of course, President Biden himself saying that the United States will again lead not just by the example of our power, but by the power of our example, and that there is no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy. And that's something we've really believed in the OGP community right from the onset of the partnership in 2011. Of course, the administration has also committed to a summit for democracy that many of you, I know, will be thinking around in terms of some of the issues we'll discuss today. So the objective is really to focus on what this very interesting political moment could mean for open government in the United States, and specifically the US domestic OGP process. And so to kick us off, I'm going to first hand over to Denise Miranda. Denise is the head of the independent reporting mechanism of OGP. And so what I'm hoping Denise can do is just set the stage a little bit for everybody, whether this is your first time in an OGP meeting or you've been in plenty. We'd like to just set the level set in terms of US participation to date. And that's what I'm hoping Denise will do. And then we'll turn to Neda to present the main findings of the report. So over to Denise.
Thanks, Joe, and hi to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And thanks in advance to Alex Howard there, who shared the latest IRM report on the chat. So if anyone's interested on what was the latest assessment from the independent reporting mechanism, you could find it there. Thanks, Alex. So the independent reporting mechanism of OGP is kind of like that critical friend, honest friend that sometimes tells you what you don't want to hear, but you need to hear. So I'm just going to briefly walk us through some of the U.S. journey in OGP, Open Government Partnership. So in 2011, global leaders, both from governments and civil society, founded the Open Government Partnership, including the U.S. in that leadership group. And domestically, the first open government plan that the U.S. submitted derived a lot from the then Obama administration Open Government Directive. So a lot of the commitments that were set forward were derived from that consultation process. And since then, the US has submitted 4 action plans to OGP, and in those action plans included 109 commitments on various policy areas. In the first 3 action plans, we saw commitments from some very interesting and very ambitious reforms on police data, the Police Data Initiative, which covers currently 130 jurisdictions, including cities like New York and Los Angeles and Detroit. And the data that is consolidated in this repository can be analyzed, extracted, and republished. And it's data that you can find on the involvement of police officers in shootings, but also the use of incidents of use of force. So it's a very useful source of data from police operations. We also saw some commitments that created professional tracks for freedom of information professionals within the federal government, and this, just helps shape and improve the framework for freedom of information in the country. We also saw some very good and important steps taken in open science. So through the action plans from the first action plans, we saw the open science policy that enabled all federally funded research to be available on federal websites. And the implementation, we have seen that since that 2015, fewer and fewer commitments have been implemented. That in part in the last 2017 period, 2019 period, due to the transition and action plans falling in the scope of two administrations, the Obama administration and the Trump administration. However, the real challenge in the US has been meaningful co-creation, meaningful participation and civil society engagement. That has been one of the challenges that the IRM and in many of their assessments have always highlighted. So while the government did ask for input and engage to some level the public during each of the action plans, the people really never got feedback on how that input was used or how those comments or feedback on commitments actually shaped the final draft of commitments. So as a result of this lack of feedback in the OGP processes and the findings that the IRM has assessed in the latest action plans, the US government received a notice that they were not complying with OGP process standards. So to fix this, the US government really needs to commit to change the way they engage civil society. So engaging a broader group of civil society, but not just in number, but in sectors, thematic areas, but also in how they engage with civil society and making sure that this feedback happens so that when people provide input, then they understand why that input matters, how that input is used, and ultimately, how does that shape decision-making. So in the, I don't want to take a lot of time because I think the conversation really needs to head towards how to make the best out of open government process in the US, but just wanted to leave you with a note that the opportunity is there, and it starts by getting the engagement with civil society and government right in order to create opportunities for work in such important policy areas. Thank you, Joe.
Great, thank you very much, Denise. So as Denise concluded, we want to learn the lessons from the previous iterations, but also very much focus this conversation on the future and what a fresh start might look like. And Neda's report is a really excellent contribution to that. So just to properly introduce Neda, Neda is the director of the Open Gov Hub, which is an initiative of global integrity, and has worked with OGP in the past few months on a series of civil society roundtables to feed into this report. But also interestingly, Neda, in the last few years now, has been working to really broaden the base of civil society engagement in open government, both within the US, but also bringing in voices internationally that could to encourage peer exchange with US democracy groups. So has a really great range of experience to bring to this. And a useful way, I think, of thinking of this report is it's about the who, like who is in the room, who's participating, the how, what's the process and the mechanism, but also the what, and what are the policy areas that could usefully be picked up in a refreshed US OGP process. So let me hand over now to Neda.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. It's really a pleasure to be in the room with all of you today. I'm gonna get a presentation up here to walk you through the key findings from the report. Hopefully everyone can see that clearly. So again, thanks so much. I'm here to talk about this report about seizing the moment, how we can revive the US OGP process in this particular time. As Joe mentioned, I was brought on as a consultant for OGP at the beginning of this year. And really the key question was to explore how this new administration can revive and improve the domestic OGP process, and really make it a priority area for pursuing ambitious reforms. So what we set about to do was conduct a series of 5 thematic roundtables, speaking to about 50 civil society leaders working across issues. The majority of folks who participated in these had some familiarity with OGP. Some had, been very involved in previous processes, and others were relatively new. But again, the goal was really to look back on previous experiences and also to understand kind of current advocacy priorities from civil society groups, which could be reflected in the next OGP process. So we covered a variety of topics in these roundtables, from transnational corruption, climate, justice issues, core democracy and good government reforms, and then we had a cross-cutting 5th and final roundtable as well. So that represented really the main source of data for this final report. In addition, I did a handful of supplemental interviews with folks who have been familiar with the process, as well as desk research, really looking closely at the myriad reports that a number of advocacy groups have produced, in the last 6 months or so, really highlighting their kind of top wish list, priorities for this new administration. So after the draft of the report was produced, I worked with OGP colleagues to review the draft, and then we also circulated the near final draft to all participants in the roundtables, as well as to a few former US government officials familiar with OGP, to solicit some comments, which were integrated into the final report. So to just spend a minute more on the broader context for why I have this conversation right now. First of all, we know that there's always some natural momentum that comes from, a political administration change. So that's certainly part of the conversation today. But in addition, we know that there's also, of course, been an escalating domestic democracy crisis at home and rising authoritarianism and backsliding democracy abroad. So, of course, this presents huge challenges, but also really a big opportunity for us to better link domestic, democracy reforms at home with US democracy promotion abroad, really in a way that probably we've never been able to before. So the OGP process is really built to make such connections, from the beginning, and I think that's part of why we're having this conversation today. Third, of course, as President Biden himself has stated, the United States faces 4 interlinked crises right now, which really are huge national priorities. The COVID health crisis, the resulting economic challenges, the climate crisis, and of course our racial justice crisis as well. So there's really a moment here where we can think about how open government reforms can contribute to solving these crises in the country today. And then finally, of course, we have a big season of summits basically over the next 12 months, including G7, OGP Summit, but of course also including the first ever Summit for Democracy, which is expected in early 2022. So taking in all the inputs across the civil society consultations, in the end, the report really centers on these 5 key process recommendations, summarized by this acronym OPALS. So first and foremost, we heard time and again, a strong consensus that people would like to see senior government ownership of the OGP process, and particularly White House leadership. There was a number of reasons given for this. So first and foremost, the leadership of White House involvement in the OGP process will help send the necessary signals to various civil society groups, that this is also a process that is worth them investing their time into. So one of the really clear takeaways from these conversations was that, civil society investment in OGP is going to be proportional to government investment in OGP. And that government really has to act first to, again, send the message that this is a useful and worthwhile process and should be a priority in terms of your engagement. So this was the first reason given for senior government ownership and specifically White House leadership. The second reason given was that White House leadership can better enable cross-agency coordination, which is also needed for OGP to be successful, mobilizing various federal agencies, but also federal commissions and others as needed to enact reforms. And then the third reason given is that the White House is kind of naturally better positioned to do the linking of domestic and international policy, which we've already mentioned. So again, the first recommendation centers on senior government ownership. Next, we have participation. As Denise and Joe have both alluded to, there's a real need and benefit from broadening and diversifying who from civil society and the public is involved in the next OGP process. There's huge benefit to work with existing coalitions who are already aggregating, the opinions and preferences of many different groups. And so we need to include and also move beyond kind of the typical usual suspects in this type of work. So including but not limited to good government groups, and really thinking about diversity and participation in terms of geographic, racial, gender, and thematic diversity from civil society side. Third recommendation centers on ambition. This is a theme, again, that appears in a number of OGP reports, but it's really important to kind of rectify a previous challenge, which was around action plans really repeating a number of policy reforms that were already in the works or that were already being planned. So people made clear, that they would like to see, obviously, the next action plan include new reforms, which link to kind of top national priorities. But ideally, there's a mix of kind of some early wins, which enable the process to gain momentum, as well as, these high ambitious reforms linking to national priorities. Fourth recommendation on looped feedback. Again, Denise mentioned this as well. One of the previous challenges in earlier processes was civil society and public input not receiving sufficient feedback, right? What happened to those inputs? So it's important to address this and really to create a structure for productive and ongoing joint work between reformers in government and reformers in civil society to follow through on mutual interests. And finally, the fifth recommendation is around synchronization. Again, really explicitly linking domestic and foreign policy efforts that relate to democracy reform and have mutual benefit and are especially important for the US to resume credible global leadership. One of the best ways to do this, of course, is to seize key political moments, during summits and beyond. So even though the main focus of the roundtables was really on the process, right? How can we actually achieve this? What does a credible process look like? Of course, people also addressed what are the actual policy changes that they want to see from the new administration. And so these 5 areas represent kind of the top policy priority areas that surface to the top in these conversations, which a number of civil society groups have mentioned. I'll move through these pretty quickly, but basically these represent 5 key areas that can be used to harvest commitments for the next action plan. So the first policy priority area is around a suite of core democracy and good government reforms. A lot of these reforms are already captured in HR 1, We the People Act, and also in the Accountability 2021 report, which was produced by a coalition of diverse groups. Ranging from voting rights and money in politics reform and many other issues. But this is obviously kind of a central area and theme, which is important. Sorry for the ambulance if you can hear it. Second set of recommendations and policy priority areas center on disclosure and declassification. This includes everything from more whistleblower reforms and protections to disclosure about use of force, domestically with police activities, but also internationally with military action and airstrikes in Syria, for example, came up. So there's a variety of recommendations, again, under disclosures and declassification. Third policy priority area is around regulating technology and generating usable data. For example, sharing information about how algorithms and AI may be used by federal agencies in decision-making, and also generating useful and usable data on a variety of thematic areas, some of which have come up in previous action plans as well as new ones. Fourth policy priority area is on criminal justice and access to justice reforms. This particular roundtable had a plethora of recommendations again, so I encourage you to take a look at the report and the additional resources from civil society in the report annex. But of course, this includes topics like reducing mass incarceration, providing access to counsel for marginalized groups, and many other topics. And then finally, fifth policy area actually centers on further implementing existing laws and international commitments that the United States has made at various points. Two quick examples here are further regulation and implementation of beneficial ownership transparency, which comes from the NDAA that was passed at the start of this year. And a second example includes strengthening Section 1504 in the Dodd-Frank Act. So finally, just to help pull these recommendations together, in the end, a lot of what this report talks about is what it could look like to design a really robust multi-stakeholder forum, right? A platform and a process that brings together reformers from government and civil society to productively work together on policy changes that are high priority. So this is just kind of one way to think about it, but it's important to think about, first of all, who's the hub, right? Who is the central coordinating body? Again, the recommendation we heard was definitely the White House, whether that's housed within the NSC or other places. But so the core coordinating body with government and civil society leaders at the center, who then coordinate with a variety of working groups, touching on the different policy areas that we've just discussed. And those working groups being the place where civil society organizations and relevant federal agencies can directly work together to specify what are the actionable priority reforms that they would like to see. So this is one way to kind of bring it all together. But I'd love to kind of hand it back now. I'm really eager to hear from our discussants as well as from the rest of you in the room today about what are some of the practical steps that we can take to, again, bring these recommendations to life, the 5 principles under the OPAL acronym, as well as thinking about what that could mean in terms of delivering actual policy changes. Yeah, so thank you, and I'll hand it back to you, Joe.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Neda. Really, really clear, great recommendations. And it reminds me, obviously at OGP, we're always trying to evaluate whether these processes around open government and multi-stakeholder consultation lead to better results. And we actually looked at all of our member countries in the first 10 years of OGP and found there is a very strong correlation between good process and good outcomes. So I know sometimes it can feel like we're talking about the intricacies of coordination, interagency processes, and so on, but we're doing it with a very strong purpose in mind, which is to get those real results from those reforms that really matter to citizens. So thank you, and again, encourage everybody to read the report as well in full. So we have 3 discussants to kind of kick off the this next part of the event, and then I really do want to hear from many of you who've joined. I can see so many people that have been integral to US open government efforts over the years from previous administrations, and really want to bring all of your expertise into the discussion as well. But to start with, we'll have Lisa, Liz, and Phil. Lisa Rosenberg is the Executive Director of the Open the Government Coalition, which many of you will know and be participating in. Liz Hempovitz is the Policy Director at POGO, that's the Project of Government Oversight, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And Philip Ashlock, Phil, is the Director of Data and Analytics at the General Services Administration from the government. So I wanted to start with Lisa to give your initial reflections to Neda's findings, and then we'll turn to Liz and then Phil.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for this work, for the effort that you've put into this report. I do think it's really an important opportunity, and hopefully we can capitalize it. As Joe said, Open the Government is a coalition of over 100 organizations that works to strengthen democracy through transparency and accountability. We do not advocate for transparency's sake. And I say that today to you all here because I think it's important for for the OGP process. It can't just be a process that, you know, that just builds, you know, more openness into the system. There has to be really strong goals. We have to strengthen our institutions. We have to create a more informed public. So whatever the goals are and the policies that Netta described, I think go towards this. But I can't emphasize enough that we need to have these overarching principles that motivate this process going forward if it's going to work. OTG has experienced having brought civil society together during previous iterations. We worked on model action plans. We worked on the report on the national action plans a couple of times. So I think I'm here partly to describe that experience and how not to repeat that experience, quite frankly. The outcome was that civil society was really discouraged for a number of reasons, to the point that many argued we really shouldn't even participate in the OGP process. And to a certain degree that by participating at all, we were giving cover to an administration that wasn't really fulfilling what civil society was requesting or the overarching goals of OGP. They could say they were working with civil society, but really they really weren't. And then there were really three reasons why why civil society was discouraged from the process earlier on. They have to go with impact, implementation, and collaboration. And all of these have been discussed a little bit today, but I will just tell you from our experience, we did a report on the second national action plan. We evaluated a number of commitments, not all of them. And of the ones we evaluated, and I think there were 15 or 16, only 2 of them were rated as transformative. 3 were rated as minor, and I think the others were moderate. So again, I think that shows you that we civil society are looking for something bigger and bolder and transformative. This is an opportunity that we should take advantage of. And if we're not going to have transformative change, the time and investment from civil society, you know, isn't worth it. We can spend our time lobbying Congress or advocating in other ways. So that's why we need to see these really bold, transformative commitments. On implementation, same thing. One of the commitments we rated as complete. 6 were rated as having made substantial progress, but 9 were rated as having made limited progress. I think that speaks for itself. And there's lots of reasons why progress is hard to make. But again, I think we need to see some wins, you know, wins on transformative recommendations, ideally for civil society to kind of get, you know, willing to be, to buy back into this process. But then the final, and I think for today's purposes, probably the most important concern is the collaboration process. And that's collaboration between civil society and government. And we found that really only one of the collaborations was rated as highly meaningful. Others were rated either adequate or limited. And I think there was no collaboration on the priority. And I think that there's a number of reasons for that have been touched on already, but I'll just emphasize them. One is that the US government should not have its priorities established before they even talk to civil society. The government needs to listen to civil society and figure out our priorities, our top priorities. And again, many of those priorities have already been spelled out and fleshed out in a number of reports, including the one that we did. But there's a lot of reports on reforming democracy and creating a more informed public. And so government should look to those existing reports, but then also really, really have a process by which to listen to see what the priorities are. You know, another major issue was really the consultation process overall, right? And I think what's really important about the OPALS process that is laid out in this report is that feedback loop that's sort of built into it. We noticed that many government officials received our recommendations, but they didn't respond, they didn't reply, they didn't say, you know, this is good, this is bad, this is unworkable, let's refine it, let's work together, let's negotiate. It was sort of like went into a black hole. So that's, again, really frustrating. It's frustrating. Civil society, with our limited resources and our limited time, you know, are kind of feeding this information to government actors, and we don't hear back from them. So we really think that that's been particularly troubling in the past. And I think that the OPALS process that is laid out in this report, I do think would go a long way towards resolving that. And I would just emphasize what has already been said. Having a key point person in the White House is critical from the get-go. If that person does not exist, and ideally that person will also have connections with civil society, that person really needs that is important if this is going to really take off the way it could. We need to see those transformative goals and have some wins early on. And we need that feedback loop, I think is really, really important. And that again is really will enhance the productivity, will enhance the feeling of value that civil society is really being listened to. One of the things that civil society, I do think, thought was important, even in the previous processes, was that we had relationships with folks in agencies, and those relationships, where they existed, were really important to get things moving and get things going. And so those need to continue as well. So a way to build on those relationships, a way for us to know who the players are, is going to be really important. And I'll stop here, but I do think that that I think the approach as laid out in the report is a really good start, but it's going to come down to the implementation.
Great, thanks very much, Lisa. Really, really good comments, and a lot, of course, which is consistent with other countries' experiences as well. And one of the things that I think the report does well is it notes a few interesting examples of, of course, every country is different, has its own context, but there's definitely learning that can be applied. I just posted one of Canada's approach on the feedback loop, which is they published what's called a What We Heard report, so that all the civil society input that's received gets a reasonably granular reaction from the government in terms of why was it included or not, where did they incorporate the feedback, and it just makes it, as you said, a more iterative and kind of frankly builds trust between government and civil society. Let me now turn to Liz to give your reflections.
Hi. Before I dive in on some of my reflections on some of the policy areas laid out in this report, I just wanted to kind of pick up on the last point Lisa was making on kind of this collaboration between civil society and government, and how the process laid out in this report is a really good one on paper, but how implementation is really going to be so critical. But I think one thing that is going unsaid and is that, organizations like POGO are much smaller than I think a lot of people would assume, kind of given the impact that we're able to have on national policy. And so because of that, right, at these small nonprofits, we are really concerned about conserving our resources and making sure that we are putting them in places where we can be most productive. And I would say that, if the next OGP process is informed by this report, and looks like the process laid out in this report, it is something that I would enthusiastically participate in and really kind of prioritize. But I think that's kind of what's at stake when we're talking about the process here, which I think is really coming through. So now I've been asked to give kind of a brief overview and reflection on the 5 policy areas laid out in this report. And actually, Lisa and I must be drinking the same coffee, because I was thinking this through too. It's not, we're not pushing for transparency's sake. That doesn't really get us anywhere, right? The point here is to, have a citizenry that feels engaged and heard by their government, and a government that reflects what the people want and what the people are asking for. And I think we are in an incredible moment right now where there are so many problems, and that certainly can be a negative and is a negative in many ways, but is also a positive in that it gives us a real opportunity opportunity to address some of these major crises that are being felt across the board, to varying degrees, of course, but really across the board, and kind of unifying our country in a way that hasn't really happened, I think, in recent times. So the 5 policy areas laid out in the report, I think, do a really good job of kind of, making sure that this is not transparency for transparency's sake. So the first one, these core democracy and good government reforms, I think these are reforms that are things that serve as guardrails against authoritarianism. So things like improved whistleblower protection, so that people inside government can come forward if they see waste, fraud, or abuse of power, particularly abuse of power against the people, I think is really important, and something that we don't often think about whistleblowers as playing a key role in, but really they do. Also, inspectors general, making sure that our internal independent watchdogs have the authorities they need to do impactful work, and also the protections they need so that they aren't themselves retaliated against for doing that kind of work. This certainly, involves a commitment from the executive branch, but also I think does involve Congress, and in many of these places we need better laws. But I think a process like one laid out in this report, and where OGP can be really helpful, is kind of identifying those places for us to really zero in on and see where can we have the most bang for our buck in terms of reforms. And then also, I think, again, included in this core democracy and good government reforms are laws that facilitate transparency into government operations, like the Freedom of Information Act, like the Presidential Records Act. It may appear counterproductive that to increase kind of people's buy-in in government and understanding of and kind of feelings that maybe that government is working in their favor, it may seem counterproductive to say we need to have better laws so that we can expose problems in government. But I don't think it is, right? I think we've got people across the country that have this sense that when the government acts incorrectly or poorly, or doesn't kind of execute its powers in the way that the people want, the sense is that does not go reported, that gets shoved under a rug, that we never have true accountability. And I think that's kind of, those are some of those sentiments that are informing this growing fear that there's massive unchecked government corruption going on. And so I really do think that kind of these transparency and accountability mechanisms are a major point in addressing that. Then the next policy area is disclosures and declassification. Again, I think in this space, reforms help rebuild some of that semblance of confidence that our government is working with the best interests of the people rather than just the politically powerful. And when we talk about kind of disclosures and declassification, every time I hear the word declassification, I think of how President Obama said, there's classified and then there's classified. We know, everybody, I think a lot of people in government, a lot of people outside of government know that we have an overclassification problem. And that comes through when the president says something like that, right? There's classified and then there's really classified. That doesn't help. That puts whistleblowers at risk. It actually undermines our security and the classification process if we're wildly overclassifying information. And so I think, broad reforms to that system are certainly timely, but will also go to kind of improve this, not faith in government, because I don't think that's what people should have, but faith that if the government is not working in your best interest, that it will come out. Maybe not right away, but hopefully within enough time to address that. I would also be remiss not to mention the Office of Legal Counsel here. That is an office I'm particularly obsessed with, because they wield just an unreasonable amount of power in terms of interpreting law in the way that's most favorable to the executive branch, doesn't necessarily reflect the best reading of the law. And they operate in near total secrecy, not just from the public, but from Congress. And so I was really glad to see them highlighted in this report. The third policy area, regulating technology and generating more usable data. I think reforms in this space help demonstrate the valuable role that the federal government can play in addressing some of the biggest biggest problems and issues facing our country. So I immediately think of kind of the COVID relief packages that we've sent, in part because Pogo's done a lot of work over the last year to make sure there is a full accounting of what is being done with that money. And unfortunately, that is just not happening right now. You know, the Congress passed really great detailed reporting requirements that would provide public data about how this money is being used, not just how it's being used either, but, you know, really specific information like how many jobs were supported by this funding at the recipient entity. And we're just not getting that information right now. And so I think it is, and people are noticing, and they are upset that we are spending so much public money, not because it wasn't necessary. I do agree that these relief packages were incredibly necessary, but we need to be able to tell the American people and show the American people, this is what we did with your hard-earned tax dollars. This is the effect that these relief packages had. It's not just that either, though. We need to be able to look at data, and I really loved the way that this was phrased, usable data, because we need data that will help show these government programs set out to do X, but they didn't do it. They accomplished Y instead. So maybe next time there is a disaster, whether or not it's a global pandemic, we know there are going to be, emergency situations in the future, and we need to be able to craft programs that are responsive to the problems. And without data to kind of to do this kind of look back and see how effective those programs were, we're just kind of guessing that what we're doing is going to be responsive to the problems. And I think, again, I think people notice, people notice that, we're just kind of trying our best rather than using evidence and data to kind of drive the policy solutions of the day. And so again, I think, it's just so critical. And I also, I thought I really appreciated how how the report also highlighted here policies on the use of emerging technologies. We've done a lot of work on how facial recognition software is being used, not just by law enforcement, but other government entities, and the threats that poses to civil rights and civil liberties. And unfortunately, we've seen just kind of on a massive scale that that our government is using new technologies without policies in place to protect civil rights and civil liberties. And that should be very concerning. And then the next area, criminal justice, civil justice, and broader access to justice reforms. The principle of fair and impartial justice is foundational to our democracy. But it's not possible unless the government creates mechanisms to ensure that the Justice Department is carrying out its responsibility well and equitably. And so, I think, again, this is just an incredibly important area. I loved some of the specific recommendations in there, and Pogo has a lot of recommendations in this space. And then also just to wrap it up, the last one was the last of the policy areas is ways to better implement existing laws and international commitments. And I think here the value is that we can show, that we're not just on this international stage making these grand commitments that we actually have no interest in kind of seeing through, right? And so I think the idea here is that we need to be able to, take those international commitments to address things like climate change and global corruption and turn those into actionable policies where we can measure the results. Again, so that we can have evidence-based policy making, so that we can show the people that its government is working to address the biggest problems that we are facing as a country, and is doing so in a way that actually kind of keeps those problems in mind, understands why those problems are affecting people's lives the way that they are, and has a real vested interest in actually addressing those problems. So I'll stop here. I'm looking forward to the discussion with everybody, and thank you so much for this opportunity to participate.
Great, thank you, Liz. Really great comments, and you've sparked a lot of debate in the chat. You might want to weigh in on and provide some replies to. I mean, again, impossible to summarize everything you said, but I was struck by when you were referencing the stimulus package and the amount being spent. I think it was back in maybe February. It was the IG at the Labor Department was estimating that fraud in the CARES Act for unemployment benefits was, I think the IG thought was running at $63 billion at that time. And I don't know if since then it may have increased. and obviously that is not good for public trust in government. And the Recovery Act, as was mentioned, was part of one of the initial OGP commitments under the Obama administration. So turning to Phil, I realize, you know, a lot of expectations on your shoulders, but would really be great to hear from the government's perspective, both how you see the report and how you see the kind of how the transition's playing out on the US's domestic OGP participation. Of course, we've seen a lot of activity on the international stage in terms of talking about anti-corruption, democracy as big new priorities for US foreign policy, but really keen to hear from you on the connection to domestic policy as well. So over to you, Phil.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for including me in this important panel. I just thought I'd provide a little bit of background on myself and kind of my role before getting into the report. So some of you may know me, some of you might not, but I have been in some shape or form involved with OGP since its founding in 2011, attending like the first launch event and the summit and most of the global summits since then. But in the first couple of years, I was on the civil society side and participated in government consultations as a member of civil society. So in good company here. And then I joined the federal government in 2013, and then have been involved with the National Action Plan process and other open government efforts in various ways since then as a career civil servant. For the past couple of years, I worked alongside Alex Covington at the State Department as the OGP points of contact for the US, with Alex more focused on the international work and myself more focused on domestic. My primary role in government is managing a portfolio of programs in GSA's Technology Transformation Services, TTS, including several related to open government, some that you may be familiar with and some you may not. So this includes data.gov and the cross-government effort to support the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act and the Open Government Data Act. The Digital Analytics Program, which helps agencies measure how the public is interacting with government websites and digital presences, with public reporting at analytics.usa.gov. And a newer program that is Feedback Analytics, which supports the White House and agencies on government-wide efforts to improve how the public interacts with government services through a variety of mechanisms, including those spelled out in OMB A11 Section 280, which establishes some standardized requirements to solicit and measure feedback from the public on some specific high-impact services, which also has public reporting at performance.gov/CX. In fact, I think the most recent quarter's data was just posted yesterday. And our office, GSA TTS, also includes a number of other programs that support the spirit of open government and strong democracy, including challenge.gov, code.gov, citizenscience.gov, USA.gov, vote.gov, and the digital registry for official social media accounts. And with regard to vote.gov, some of you may have seen the executive order from a few months ago to sort of expand the reach and kind of provide a more inclusive platform with that. Before I go further, I just want to say thank you for the report. Thank you to Nada and all civil society organizations and everyone who contributed to this. I know things like this take a tremendous amount of work, and I just want you to know from our perspective, it's very helpful to have reports like this to get this perspective and to sort of help guide our work moving forward. Fundamentally, I'm here with two key messages that I understand probably won't and shouldn't satisfy many of you as much as we would like. First, we hear and understand the critiques regarding the fourth National Action Plan and the lack of substantive involvement with OGP domestically. And second, that we're working hard to build a way forward for US government engagement in OGP. I'd like to kind of echo what some of my colleagues in government, like Scott Busby at the State Department, have recently said, that we reaffirm the US support for the Open Government Partnership, both at home and abroad. Our engagement with OGP is based on 4 fundamental beliefs. First, that corruption undermines democracy, sabotages development gains, hinders economic growth, and endangers human rights. Second, that transparency is crucial to development and protection of effective and accountable government systems. Third, that civic engagement, partnership with civil society, and the feedback loop between government and citizen is central to the development of effective public policy. And fourth, that harnessing new and emerging technologies is critical to overcome the challenges we face in the 21st century. We also recognize that upholding these principles takes hard work and dedication, and that no country, including our own, is immune to the challenges that can make this work difficult. We can speak from a place of honesty and humility in acknowledging that this is hard work and that we have a lot more work to do. We know that we must continually strive to deepen engagement with civil society, institutionalize advances, and address weaknesses wherever they appear. Over the next year and a half, the Biden-Harris administration will demonstrate our commitment to OGP and its underlying values through action. We look forward to working alongside a diverse and a representative set of civil society actors to produce an ambitious yet feasible open government agenda, including as we look to the co-creation of our 5th National Action Plan. Before I address the report itself, I thought it might be helpful to just make sure everyone has some basic shared understanding of where the US is in the National Action Plan cycle. So as I'm sure you know, the current and national action plans can be found on open.usa.gov. The current one, the 4th one, was put out in 2019. As has already been said today, and as I expect many of you are familiar with, the criticisms around, I expect many of you are familiar with the criticisms around the current National Action Plan, much of which was covered in the IRM design report, as well as in this current report. And so, the IRM design report cited our deficiencies with having a truly robust co-creation process and a lack of ambition around many of the commitments. We acknowledge this, we understand. Also, just in terms of where we are in the process, typically a National Action Plan covers 2 years of implementation. However, last year, the OGP gave countries the option to extend their current National Action Plan by an additional year to account for possible delays associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the US opted to take this extension, which means that our current action plan is scheduled to conclude in August of next year, of 2022. That said, some of the unfinished work in the current National Action Plan concerns our next National Action Plan, as Commitment 8 in our current plan is focused on having a broader and more inclusive co-creation process for developing our next National Action Plan. But ideally, you wouldn't need me to be providing you with the status here just to know where we are with the process, because one of the newer OGP requirements for National Action Plan implementations is to have a public online repository with updates every 6 months. We do not currently have this online, but this is something that we're actively working to address to provide future updates on the status of our National Action Plan implementation. To sort of speak more directly to the report itself, I think just can speak frankly and say, we see you, we hear you, we recognize the need to improve. We are still formulating exactly how to operationalize everything needed here as part of this administration, but I can assure you that a core focus of this administration is revitalizing our democracy, working with like-minded partners in civil society to demonstrate what robust and resilient democracy looks like in action, and to prove that democracy still holds the key to freedom, prosperity, peace, and dignity. I can assure you that we are actively working to strengthen our work on implementation and future development of our action plans, as well as engagement with stakeholders like those represented here. This is no small task, obviously, but again, I assure you that we are working on this. And while I may not be able to provide much in the way of specific details today, I want you to know that many of the considerations in this report are consistent with the conversations we're having internally, and we expect to share more with you all in the near future. And while I'm the one speaking today, you should know that this is a team effort. I'm working on this myself. There are multiple White House offices actively engaged on this, as well as the State Department, USAID, and other departments and agencies, which have recently identified themselves as wanting to step up and support this work more moving forward. One of the central arguments in the report, obviously, is that to effectively and meaningfully deliver our national action plans, we need to have a better process in place. We couldn't agree more. But before we get, before we get ahead of ourselves by thinking about a whole new set of commitments, we are committed to getting the process right. That means doing the hard work to better institutionalize this process within the government with the right leadership and clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And it means doing the hard work with all of you to better establish a robust multi-stakeholder forum, to have ongoing channels of dialogue with the public and with a more diverse and inclusive group of stakeholders. There are a lot of different parts of the government that need to be actively engaged and coordinated to effectively deliver on our action plans. And there are many parts of the government invested in the process of OGP-related activities internationally. As the report identifies, it is important for these to all work together more closely. So, we do see also that there's an opportunity to explore building a bigger tent at home, including other parts of the US government, such as the legislative branch, as well as more collaboration with state and local partners. We recognize that the work done to advance OGP principles internationally must be backed by our ability to advance these principles at home. And we recognize that there's a lot we can learn from the work of other countries to help us do better at home. In fact, we are currently actively looking at what other countries have done as we work to improve our process and improve institutionalization of our domestic efforts. I'm not going to go into a detail, and I don't necessarily have detail to offer about all the different recommendations in here. I think there have been a few things mentioned already today in terms of sort of potential alignment with policy recommendations and some ongoing work. Things like HR1, have been mentioned, as well as I mentioned the executive order on vote.gov, and just to highlight, just because there was a memo released today, but with regard to access to justice, there were policy recommendations in the report concerned with access to justice reforms. And I can't speak authoritatively on that topic, but I can highlight that earlier this week, the White House released the memo on restoring the Department of Justice access to justice function and reinvigorating the White House Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, which I think has some alignment with that recommendation. So I just wanted to highlight that since that was a recent announcement this week. And I think I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Phil. I really appreciate both the content and the spirit of your comments. And I think as we've heard, this is still a good time for people to be chiming in with your recommendations and thoughts, because that internal process is ongoing as to figuring out the new configuration of OGP. So in that respect, the report, I hope, was really well timed and really glad to hear that it was useful, Phil, because that's obviously the intent here is to try and support you and your colleagues in figuring this out. So we have about 30 minutes remaining, and I would love to bring in a lot of the expertise we have in this virtual room. There is a very lively chat thread with lots of different kind of questions and links being shared. But if people wouldn't mind using the hand function, if you actually want to come in and unmute yourself or come off video and make a contribution, that would be great. Would love to hear from some of you. So anybody want to either add your own reflections or ask a specific question to any of our speakers? I know this is not a shy group normally. And I do have people I would love to hear from who I can also call on. Anyone want to kick us off? No? Okay. Okay, Alex. Alex? We can hear you.
Okay, great. It's amazing. After a year, I'm still figuring out how to use the mute button. Thank you for creating this forum and this conversation. Particularly thank you to Phil for speaking to all of that. I think that's the first time I've heard from the US about this in a couple of years. I guess my question is this. In other countries, OGP has a robust multi-stakeholder network, which I alluded to in the chat. Both Liz and Lisa in their remarks have spoken to the capacity issues. But at a fundamental level, most of the efforts towards good governance and democracy forum in the US have moved to lawsuits through the courts or through reform in Congress or the regulatory processes. What should all the good governance groups who are thinking about devoting capacity to this or not make of this sort of implicit perception, or I guess this proposition that OGP will be a meaningful platform to achieve any commitments that this administration doesn't want to make? For instance, the Biden White House is now voluntarily disclosing some visitor logs as open data online, which is terrific. Would they support Representative Quigley's bill to make that a mandatory permanent thing so that it can't just be reversed in the next administration? Will OGP actually include Congress or not, when it has been in the past an exclusively executive branch effort? My observation in other countries is that it's much more successful when the parliaments and the judicial branches are involved. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question.
Great, thanks, Alex. Katie, I can also see your hand if you want to go.
Sorry about that. I was trying to get unmuted. Yeah, my name is Katie. I'm with the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition. We represent academic and research libraries at college and university campuses. Just want to thank everyone again for providing this forum. We have been involved in previous iterations as a civil society member, and just wanted to reiterate again a couple commitments. One is that both under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration, we saw, an important commitment being public access to federally funded research. This was important, seen by and acknowledged both by the government and civil society before the coronavirus pandemic happened. And it's even more important now after the coronavirus pandemic happened to embolden our response to a virus or another pandemic like this, but also a number of global and national challenges. So I think that's really important for us to still stay focused on, be it so that the mom can read about her son being diagnosed with diabetes type 1 and what that means. She should be able to access that information because she paid for it, but also allowing scientists to more easily collaborate and share research so that we can respond to big global challenges. But also from a more kind of specific perspective on what this effort has been able to do in the past. And I know my colleague Cable Green is on here from Creative Commons. There have been great things done in the past. Specifically, the State Department put out an open licensing playbook for other federal agencies. And that's kind of an example of something that it was put out right before the change of administration between Obama to the Trump administration. That resource is out there, but again, kind of a black box on what is happening with that now. And so I think, as we continue thinking about there was lots of good work, as folks have said, in agencies in the past. How do we kind of revamp those again and make it clear that those haven't gone into a black box completely, and then build on those efforts? So just want to thank everyone again and wanted to make those 2 points.
Great, thanks, Katie. There's also, Katie has also, a different Katie has asked in the chat about the link to the Summit for Democracy and the pay-to-play model concept for that summit, which effectively means what commitments will the US bring itself. So I'm going to now pause, Alex, to your question. I'm going to now go straight to these answers. I just wanted to collect a couple, and I think, look, some of these questions are obviously for all of us, for all of you to figure out and decide. But I obviously would like to hear from maybe starting with our discussants, if Lisa, Liz, or Phil want to come in on any of those. Liz, I can see you've taken the mic.
Yeah. I'm not shy about jumping in. I wanted to, I think Katie and Alex both hit on something important about how to kind of make these, make changes and reforms long lasting. And I think Katie, the way you put it, make sure they don't just go into like some black box somewhere. That's why I think, Alex's suggestion that Congress play a role in this, or that is a stakeholder that's consulted, is really important. I make no secret of the fact that I'm kind of a first branch supremacist, but that's because, the changes in administration in our executive branch, I think, do have really big ramifications, especially in the accountability world, especially in the government transparency world. And if we're relying solely on executive branch commitments, that means, maybe half the time we are going to be very disappointed. And so I think kind of figuring out a way to make sure that we are not just relying on the executive branch to correct some of these problems that, let's be really frank, the executive branch has played a role in creating. I think that's how we make sure that the momentum keeps going, that we keep moving in the right direction rather than kind of bouncing back and forth between these two very different standards.
Great, thanks, Liz. Lisa?
Yeah, I would, echo that. I agree that, to have permanent change, we need legislative change. I mean, I think that goes without saying, but I would say that a meaningful OGP co-creation process that involves executive branch career officials, not necessarily politicals, but career folks in the agencies, get them bought in, get them committed, give them ownership of, making these changes. And they could last from administration to administration to administration. In the end, yeah, we still definitely need Congress, and we need Congress to make sure that these things are permanent. But I do think it's important to work within the executive branch and to create those allies. And again, that a lot of that comes with the executive branch letting us as civil society know who those allies are. We need those contacts, we need those meetings, we need a regular way to get in touch with these folks. And then that's that feedback loop that we've already talked about.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Phil?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think just on the topic of kind of shared kind of ownership and roles and responsibility and resilience through transition. I mean, I think that's certainly a topic that's top of mind for us as well. And I think there's a lot of options on the table to explore that further, some of which have been mentioned. I mean, I think there's certainly openness to figuring out what a sort of more inclusive process that includes, more of the other branches of the federal government is certainly something to explore, and I expect to see some movement on that front in the near future. Nothing to announce, but I think that's something that's going to be explored further. I think that to that effect, I think there's also an opportunity to have deeper connections with state and local partners as well. But there's another question around kind of how to incentivize civil society participation and sort of have faith in the process. And I think there's a couple of different answers to that. I mean, I think fundamentally it's demonstrating the value and impact, why participation is worthwhile. But I think there's lots of other things to explore in terms of helping to support kind of more capacity in participating in a multi-stakeholder forum. I don't know exactly all the things that looks like, but I think we're looking at what other countries have done as well to help support sort of a resilient multi-stakeholder forum and sort of make sure that there is capacity and that there is that value sort of seen as well. But it's obviously going to take hard work, and it's going to take a lot of us working together and sort of having some trust in the process to get there. And the questions around access to around federally funded research, access to public health, I can't provide much detail on that, although I think in terms of the current commitments, as I mentioned before, we do not currently have a online repository that sort of details the status of them, but I think to the effect that those commitments are in our current National Action Plan, I would hope that we could publish more details on the status of that work moving forward. I know there's also, I think, some related progress through like the 21st Century Cures Act and the work of HHS ONC on access to public health data and clinical data and things like that. So I can't sort of speak to that authoritatively myself, but I know that there's more to share, and I hope that we can include those details as we provide more updates on the current National Action Plan.
Great, thanks, Phil. And Neda?
Yeah, just to pick up a little bit more on the point around ownership question again, I think what we know from a lot of OGP countries is kind of the ideal scenario is that you have active buy-in from both political leadership and career civil servants. And the central coordinating hub is that senior political leadership that signals to the agencies, the reformers, again, inside and outside government, that this is a priority, you need to act on this. And then, but the rubber hits the road really with the agencies, the civil servants who know what can be operationalized, what is not feasible. So again, I think as we try to visualize like what is the multi-stakeholder forum structure, it's really critical to think about those links between political and career officials. And then second, I just wanted to underscore as well, like, again, as we think about the nature of the commitments that could emerge from a good process, it's simple, but I think it is really powerful to keep reflecting about what commitments could relate back to these four, present crises that have been named and kind of defined from the very top from President Biden himself. And I think it would just make it easier to start thinking about things in that context, at least, because we know that there's been a strong enough signal from the highest political leadership that, everyone beneath needs to be thinking about these things and asking what role do they play in the process.
Great, thanks, Neda. Maybe I can just add 2 quick points from the OGP side. One on the civil society capacity question, which I think Liz and Alex both raised. And obviously this is not unique to the US, but is a reality that civil society working on these issues tends to be really under-resourced in comparison to other sectors, I would say, and in fact there are particular challenges in certain developed countries, although you wouldn't always think of it that way, because obviously some of the overseas aid money, although that's also now been slashed, including by my own country, unfortunately, for this work. So there is a trade-off. I just want to kind of recognize that and come back to this point that the process has to be worth civil society participation. It can't just be for the sake of it, because as you have all pointed out, there are many other avenues for advocacy and achieving your goals. And the OGP process, we think, can be a really helpful tool, but only if it does have this, has some of the principles and structures that we've been discussing today to actually make it a useful space for all of you. And then just to respond to Alex's question, which was directly aimed at OGP as an institution, I guess. The way I would see this is OGP is absolutely a platform for all of you to consider using, and OGP doesn't advocate on specific commitments that the US should make. That's entirely up to US civil society citizens and government reformers to figure out. But there are values and principles of open government that we advocate for, and there are process recommendations that are derived from the independent reporting mechanism, which have included the role for the White House in terms of helping to give that political kind of oversight to the process. So that's at least how I see the distinction in terms of process and policy and OGP's role itself. So let me see if there are any other people that want to raise their hand and contribute to the discussion. It would be great to hear from some others. And Phil, there's a question lined up for you, which we'll come to in a second, but I just want to see if anybody else wants to chime in. I know we have people here that have been really involved in prior iterations of OGP. It would be great to hear from you as well. Okay, Alan Hudson.
Cool, my video's not working for some reason, but hopefully you can hear me. So just a quick thought from a distance and from someone who's certainly not an expert on the OGP process in the US or in the UK either, given that I've only recently moved back here. But I'm wondering how many local OGPs there are now in the US and whether there is energy and examples from the local level that might help to revive OGP processes at national level.
Thanks, Alan. And I hope and I think we have 1 or 2 people involved in either the Austin or LA process. There are 2 on the call. So I wonder if I can ask you to respond to Alan's question on that. I'm now trying to find where they are. Maybe they have logged off, but in the meantime, I'm just wondering if anyone from the civil society side who's been involved at the local level would want to help respond to Alan's question. If not, I'll go back to the panel. Okay, I can't see any activity. So any of our panelists want to address this, the local question in terms of lessons from Austin and LA and how the kind of coordination between national and local is going?
Sure. So Austin has been a member for several years. I forget exactly when they started, while LA just more recently joined. So there hasn't been much interaction with LA yet. I don't think that we can speak to. Austin, I think it was more sort of informal kind of conversations and sort of sharing experiences. I don't think we had we've ever had a very well structured kind of mechanism to kind of collaborate more closely. But I think that's we definitely have the opportunity to do that more and potentially encourage more local participation by other state and local partners as well.
And Phil, do you want to address Alex's follow-up in the chat while you have the floor?
Sure. Or I don't know, Alex, do you want to paraphrase your question here on your microphone, or should I just okay, I'll just see if I can answer it.
You want me to paraphrase, Phil?
Sure.
I mean, sure. The question I have, I guess, goes to OGP at an existential level as a model for good governance reform in the United States. Like, when I recall of it is when Samantha Power and Nathaniel Heller, who was part of all right, I'll start my video, was part of Global Integrity, is that it grew out of the voluntary plans that the Obama administration put up as part of their open government directive, and then expanded that plan with the idea that there'd be a global upward pressure on open government and democracy with this IRM in there that would make it harder for governments to backslide. And so the question is, when our government tried to backslide in the last 4 years, it seemed to be incredibly successful at doing that, regardless of its participation in OGP. And so it seemed like it's required to have a leader who believes in democracy. It's required to have someone who invests legitimacy in the process by saying they will add a commitment to the national policy or plan that they don't want to make. So my question to you and the rest of US government people who are engaging here, since this is an opportunity to talk to all the civil society organizations, like, should we think that participating will lead to there being reforms passed that are permanent and can't just be pushed away because someone doesn't like them? And to give a substantive example, EITI, right, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the standard for disclosure about payments, that got ripped away by the Trump administration within the first month of office, I think even on the first day, even though that was one of the canonical achievements of OGP. Will the Biden administration commit to bringing that back or doing anything else it doesn't want to? I don't know if that's paraphrasing, but it's the core question I have about the legitimacy of OGP and the question of it re-engaging with all of us after 4 years of the Trump era. Thanks for the opportunity to ask the question.
So as I think you mentioned in your comment, I mean, just as I said, this question may be above my pay grade. And I mean, I think maybe another way I was sort of framing the question is, as an example, is could the OGP process be a mechanism more for like direct democracy types of sort of action or commitment? And I can't give you an answer for that right now, but I think the broader question of the sort of the impact and the influence, the power that it has, as kind of a co-equal or as a way to sort of balance, otherwise unilateral decisions, I think is something that would, have to be explored if we talk about, a stronger role for other branches of government in the process, as well as, ways to have a more robust and resilient and meaningful multi-stakeholder forum. So I can say that.
I know it's an unfair question to ask of you. There should be a White House official on the call we can ask about it, but I appreciate you fielding it.
Sure.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, so let's
if I could chime in just for a second on this as well, because it was interesting. In a couple of the roundtables, this came up, and I just want to acknowledge too that, like, I think there's different opinions, from different civil society leaders about the importance of prioritizing, short-term impact versus long-term sustainability. So are these reforms going to be resilient through future political changes, versus are they a high enough priority in the short term to really be transformative, as Lisa mentioned. So yeah, I think, there's just different opinions about that topic. And it was interesting to see that come up in our discussions, because I don't think everyone is on the same page, but there is a consensus, obviously, that like both are important, but if you don't get either, then that really reduces the value of engagement. So depending on the topic, it can vary, but I do think it's important. And I will also mention too that, we had discussed in some of these roundtables, how to broaden the scope of civil society participation. And again, I think there's a trade-off to think about there in terms of early wins, which can signal to newcomers that this is an interesting advocacy channel for us to pursue, right? And that we should come to the table, again, versus the longer term sustainability question. There's some reasons to focus on the short term as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Neda. So we only have about 6 minutes left, and I'll give Lisa, Liz, and Phil a chance just to say a final minute. But anybody else want to jump in before we go back and begin to wrap this up? I think I saw Maha. Are you on the line?
I am. Hi, Joe.
Hi.
So first, I want to thank Neda for the great report, and especially for focusing on justice. For folks here, I was formerly with the U.S. government in the Office for Access to Justice, so Phil was very happy to see the announcement this week on the reinvigoration of the access to justice work, both at the White House and the Department of Justice. I should also confess that I'm a consultant with OGP, so I have a few hats here that are relevant to the conversation. I supported by Pathfinders for Justice to try to advance the justice work throughout the partnership. And on that score, I just wanted to acknowledge that, the justice work in the action plan, the third action plan for the US government, had some good had some access to justice commitments. And then of course that work got muted over time under the prior administration. So I would say that interestingly, at that same time, as the US got a little bit more quiet on this work, the global community really ramped up its participation in OGP on justice. So I think, especially as Neda points out in the report, for the US civil society community to really consider, especially those concerned about issues of justice, to consider OGP as a platform is something that I think can be very exciting, especially given the presidential memorandum from this week that explicitly talks about Goal 16. It talks about the ways in which that interagency US's domestic implementation, and really provides an opportunity, as what was described earlier, to think about connecting both our activities abroad as well as our activities at home. So I think some of the stuff's been posted in the chat, and I'll post the links as well. Thanks, Joe.
Great, thanks, Maha. So I think I can't see any other hands. So let me start with Lisa, then Liz, Phil, and Neda, if you want to go in that order, just with any final reflections.
Sure, and thanks again. Thanks to everybody. I think this has been a really thoughtful conversation, and especially Neda for the tremendous work on the report. I think I'm sitting here looking at kind of the audience and who's participating in this Zoom call today, and I think the numbers are encouraging. I think you all should be really pleased that enough folks are interested in the OGP process, and where it might go that you got, I don't know, dozens of folks on this Zoom, which I think suggests what I believe, which is that there's hope, right, that this process could really work. But I'm seeing some missing folks. There's organizations that I think I would like to see, and part of our coalition, and sort of for lack of a better word, some of the usual suspects, but these are the real experts in openness and transparency, oversight, accountability, who I'm not seeing on this call. And that, that's anecdotal, obviously, but I think it suggests that, especially the US government, your work is cut out for you. If you really want this to work, the outreach to some of those usual suspects, as well as some important new players, has got to begin in earnest, and be really directed and really intentional for this process to work. So, I would just say that I think, there's skepticism, but there is also a little dose of optimism, and we want this process to work. We could see the potential, So we're hopeful, and thank you, Phil, for taking the time, especially to be on this call as well. I think that's helpful as well. So thank you.
Yes.
Again, I think Lisa and I are drinking the same coffee this morning. My, the two big takeaways I think for me from this conversation in the report, and I thought the report laid this out really well, is that government really does have to play a big role here. That's where the power is. I think we need high level involvement from the government to make this worth people's time. There's so much potential with this process, but I think there's also, we've got some room to make up for, because the last couple of years have been incredibly difficult, and this process hasn't always worked the way that in the best way that it could. And I think kind of reflecting on that and acknowledging that is a really important point. But the other big takeaway I had is just how important it is. And again, I thought it was incredible that it was such a high, it was reiterated in the report a couple times, the importance of featuring new voices and voices, specifically voices of affected communities. I think that's one way how we continue to reiterate the point and demonstrate the point, and illustrate the point that this is not transparency for transparency's sake. It's because these principles and these ideals affect people's daily lives, and maybe our community hasn't done the best job of kind of illustrating how that is on a large scale. And I think those are the communities that are going to help us do that in the most effective and authentic way. And so I do want that to continue to be kind of a focus of those involved in shaping this process. And again, thank you for convening this. Thank you for that report, and thank you to everybody for this discussion today.
Super. Phil?
Sure. So just to reiterate, thank you so much for including me in this panel. Thank you, Sonata, and everyone who contributed and put together this report. We do find it very useful, and there's a lot. It provides a lot for us to work from and to build on. So certainly expect to hear more about how we can really operationalize things. But we recognize this is going to take a tremendous amount of work, and that we really have our work cut out for us. And it's going to take time, it's going to take hard work and dedication, and it's going to take a lot of collaboration and engagement with all of you. So I appreciate you continuing to be engaged, and I think it's always good to have some healthy level of skepticism, but hopefully we can build on that optimism and really sort of create a richer, more robust and resilient sort of partnership with civil society to make this a bigger, more lasting, sort of more impactful sort of framework to move forward into the future. So plenty of work cut out for us, but we recognize that, and we really want to continue to work with you all to deliver on this potential. So thank you.
Thanks. And Neda.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really motivated by the will, I think, that really exists on both sides, again, to get this right. And I just want to acknowledge as a last point that the United States is really the only OGP country that has so many people outside of our borders who have a stake in this process, in us getting the domestic process right? Because we really can't have credible leadership on democracy promotion abroad if we're not doing it at home. So I just want to acknowledge that's maybe a big weight to carry, but it's a huge opportunity. And I think we can use that to motivate all of us to really kick into action.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks for everybody for really actively participating, and especially to everyone who was a discussant, and of course, especially to Neda and everyone who helped feed into Neda's report. Again, please do read it. I think it's really excellent. I can say myself as a non-American that American leadership really does matter on this topic. I can tell you, from seeing the kind of shifts in terms of OGP globally, a lot of countries are looking to see what happens in terms of the US's OGP participation under this administration, with a lot of excitement, but also a lot of learning to offer. And I guess my final kind of just offer from the institutional side of OGP is that many of these issues have been addressed by other countries. There is lots of learning that we can share, really specific on different themes, or on processes, or on presidential transitions, on how to organize these conversations. there's a huge amount that has been built up in the first 10 years of OGP that I think is really applicable to this moment in the US. And the report does a great job of kind of summarizing a lot of that. But of course, there's a lot of detail that underpins it. And we as the support unit are available and here to help all of you, whether in government or civil society, as you navigate this next step. So hope we can reconvene at some point and maybe even see the launch of a OGP US multi-stakeholder forum. Would be great to see that in the coming months. And just really appreciate all of your time again on a Friday for sticking with us, and hope to see you all soon and have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you.